Okay, so we are on Daf Mem Aleph. We're on page 41a, and we mentioned that Rabbi Yosef and some say Rabbi Yitzchok explain the verse of the fruits that Israel is blessed with. Eretz chitu usa'ira, v'gefen usa'ina v'rimain, Eretz zeis shemen udvash. This verse that talks about the 7 species, they explain it to the order of the verse is specific. It means it's significant. It's telling us that it should be in that order, and that would be the order if the brachas are different, or if the brachas are the same. That would be the order. According to this understanding of, this fits with this new understanding of the argument of Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, that Rabbi Yehuda would follow this logic, even if the brachas are different. And the way you see that from this statement is because he says, Kol hamuktam b'pasuk zeh muktam lebracha. Whatever is earlier in this pasuk is earlier for the bracha. That means that you're reciting brachas on each, and you would recite the bracha on the thing that's earlier before you recite it on the items that are later. And so that would be the understanding here, that we're saying Rabbi Yehuda has his view of how important the Shivas Haminim are, the 7 species are important, that they would come, that there would be a preference within the laws of brachas, that you would have a bracha of the 7 species. If you have different items of the 7 species, the bracha of the earlier thing that's written in the 7 species comes before a bracha of something later in the 7 species, and that would be a forget what a kal v'chomer is in English. An a priori argument. It would prove that for sure, if you have a species that is not from the 7 species, and you have something that is from the 7 species, you would for sure recite the bracha on the 7 species first. Because even within the 7 species, we're so careful to recite to give respect to the item that's earlier in the verse. Now, the only question that needs to be asked, or one of the questions that needs to be asked, is, does anyone argue on this? Because what are the rabbis going to do? The other opinion. What's the other opinion going to say about this? Yes, Susan.
Okay, when you say there's precedence, it has to go by the order, but the wine comes first, no matter what. When
grapes. First of all, let's say grapes.
Grapes come first. If you're gonna make a blessing with a glass of wine before you eat, that comes first. Correct? Not the food.
Wait, say that one more time. The wine comes before food because of Kiddush? Is that what you mean?
Yes, of course.
Well, on Shabbos, you have to recite Kiddush, right? Because you can't eat anything without Kiddush.
Correct.
But that doesn't mean that in general, the blessing, it doesn't necessarily mean that the blessing of the wine would go before bread. It just means for Kiddush, you need to, because it's Shabbos and you need to say Kiddush first, you would need to recite the bracha on wine before you recite the bracha on the bread. But it doesn't mean, in other words, it's not necessarily telling us a law about wine versus bread. It is telling us a law that grapes, in other words, here we're dealing with grapes, and we're saying that grapes will come before the next food item. Geffen, se'ena, it will come before figs and pomegranates and so on. And when it comes to the actual, now that's regarding grapes. Now, if you want to jump to the laws of wine, laws of wine are in a different category, and it's not what the verse means when it says v'gefen. In other words, it doesn't fall into that category where it says v'gefen. Gefen means the grapes. Now the bracha bari pri hagofen. So does bari pri hagofen come before olives?
Exactly. That's what my question is.
And dates, let's say. So there is an argument about it. It's not so simple. Again, the verse the Gemara that we're learning is talking about grapes, not the wine that's made from grapes. So the wine that's made from grapes that's another discussion, really. Now, there is a view that says that wine goes before olives and dates, and wine is a certain special bracha that it's very specific, and it does go before those items, but not based on this verse. That's based on the fact that wine is a specified bracha.
So why, I don't understand why.
First, it's talking about grapes. So in other words, you're jumping to another discussion, and I'm answering your question, but it's not this verse. This verse is specifically talking about grapes. And the order of the items here are grapes.
Just the order of the food, the way, what they're talking about is the order that you say your blessings, and it has nothing to do with the blessing of wine.
There's two things. There's the order of brachas, and there's also the preference when you recite one bracha, what should you recite it over? What should you eat first? So it's inclusive to both of these. In other words, it really is, both of these ideas are included in this discussion of whatever's earlier in the verse is earlier for the blessing.
Okay.
So there is a preference.
In other words, we go by this verse, whatever
earlier mentioned.
Earliest stuff is first.
Right.
Okay.
Ben.
Yeah, I think your previous question was, Rabbi Yehuda said that the 7 minim are first, and you asked what the Rabbanim are saying.
Right. What will they say?
What?
Yes.
That's what it is.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you. So what did you want to answer that?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to answer when I had
Yeah.
The Rabbanim says whatever you like most, the Chaviv is first.
Right.
If the brachas are even, if they are not, then there's no discussion. Everybody.
Well, there's
says,
an argument about that.
You say 2 brachot. You say on both things.
Again, we said that there are 2 Amoraim that argue about Pligi Bar, Reb Ami, and Reb Yitzchok Nafcha, and one says that Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis argue in such a case, and one says they don't argue in that case when the brachas are different. Everyone agrees they argue when the brachas are the same. The question is, do they argue when the brachas are different? So there is an opinion that they do argue when the brachas are different. So yesterday we mentioned that there's 2 ways of reading the Gemara, and one way was that it says Di Amar Reb Yosef, and the other is that it's just Amar Reb Yosef. And if you read it that it's Amar Reb Yosef, what it comes out is Reb Yosef's statement could go according to everyone. Right? This statement could be, it goes according to everyone. It depends if it's Di Amar or Amar. Di Amar means since Reb Yosef says, which means it's a continuation of what it said before. And what it said before was talking in the opinion of Reb Yehuda that gives precedence to the 7 species. This opinion, this statement of Reb Yosef or Reb Yitzchok is a continuation of that idea. It's following Reb Yehuda only. Now, according to the other way of reading it, that it's Amar Reb Yosef, it's missing that one letter, Daled. According to that text, what comes out is that this is really according to everyone, that the rabbis would agree to Reb Yehuda in a certain scenario. And we mentioned what would that scenario be? that scenario would be that if you cherish both food items the same, then you should follow the 7 species because you cherish them the same. So now you have this law of Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yitzchok that, okay, there's no reason to give precedence to one over the other if you look at what you cherish, but there is a reason to give preference now because of the 7 species, which means the rabbis agreed to the concept that the 7 species do have a significance regarding the laws of Brochos according to this way of reading it. So that's really where we're up to. And the Gemara now tells us that there is another explanation of why another opinion of the reason why the Torah wrote all these 7 species regarding their importance is to teach us a different law, not to teach us the laws of preference, but rather to teach us a law about the measurements of the Torah. So again, according to this opinion, interestingly enough, he's explaining that the Torah doesn't tell us this verse because it wants to tell us the fruits that Israel is blessed with. But rather that the laws of measurements are based on these fruits. And it doesn't matter the order of the brachos. The idea of mentioning these fruits is to teach us something about the laws of measurements in the Torah. So what does this mean?
Means that Reb Yosef and Reb Hanan don't agree.
That's correct. That's true. So now I do have to just mention that it's not that he doesn't agree that Israel is blessed with these, but he's saying that this verse, the emphasis of this verse, is not telling us the order of the prophets, and it's not telling us this law. It's telling us a law regarding the measurements. Now, what does that mean? So here we have the Gemara, and I'll just tell you where. Let me tell you where we're going to start from. Pliga de Rab Chana, and that is Pliga de Rab Chana is about maybe 12 lines up from the bottom of the page. Pliga de Rab
in the Steinsalz.
Now, there's really 2 things. One is that Israel is blessed with these delicious fruits, and Israel is blessed with fruits that we learn the laws of measurements from. And it's not important the order, rather there are different measurements in the Torah. In other words, if you follow the reason that the verse is mentioning these items to teach us a law about measurements, so it doesn't matter what the order is, it matters the fact that each of them are mentioned here to teach us that Israel is blessed with these fruits that the laws of the Torah are based on these fruits. Now, what does Reb Chanan really say? The Amar Reb Chanan. So again, we're back in the Gemara, 12 lines up. The Amar Reb Chanan says, Kol pasuk kulon kuloi l'shiyurim nemar. The whole verse is mentioned for measurements. Chita, the reason why it mentions chita, which is wheat, Ditnan, because we learned in a Mishnah, and the Mishnah says that hanichnas lebeis hamenuga, a person who enters a house that has nega tzoras on the house, which means the house has a certain growth that is called leprosy of the house. It's a biblical leprosy of the house, and it has some type of discoloration on the wall. So a person who enters that house that was established to be a house of tzaras, and the issue is, does one's clothing become tameh, and when does it become tameh? So it doesn't matter if he's carrying the clothing or he's wearing the clothing. So it says in the verse says, a person who comes to the house is impure until evening. That's what it says. If you come to the house, you are impure until evening. But it doesn't mention the clothing. Now, it says that a person who eats in the house has to wash his clothing. So what we see here is that it depends on the amount of time that you spend in the house. If you spend in the house the amount of time that you would be able to eat, whatever the Torah means by that, but it's a measurement of time, eating, whatever time frame the Torah is referring to, then a person's clothing will become tameh. Again, because the verse initially says you come to the house, you're impure. And then it says if you eat in the house, your clothing also becomes impure. So what we see from there is entering the house doesn't make your clothing impure. Only if you eat in the house, or which means you wait in the house an amount of time that it would take to eat, that's when your clothing becomes impure. Now, based on what I just told you, there's two questions. Number one is, so how long is eating? And number two, what happens if you're holding the clothing? If you're not wearing the clothing, what happens then? Is wearing the clothing important, or is holding the clothing important? What do you need a certain amount of time, or is it both? Do you need a certain amount of time before the clothing becomes impure? How long is it, and what clothing? Is it only clothing you're wearing, or does it also include clothing you're carrying? So the verse says, he who comes to the house. What comes? That which comes into the house. So the understanding is that even your clothing that you're carrying, if you're carrying a suitcase with clothing, that becomes impure immediately. It's the clothing you're wearing that takes time till it becomes impure. So that's based on the verse. It says, "V'haba el habayis," that which comes to the house, including clothing that comes into the house. Only the clothing you're wearing will it take time till it becomes impure. Yes, Ben.
I understood it just certain items, you're not coming in naked. It's just your rings and your shoes, and I think there was something else.
We're not talking. No, we're talking. You came to the house fully clothed, but the question is, how
so
long?
Both cases you are fully clothed.
Yeah. But the thing is, what becomes tameh right away, and what takes time to become tameh? And the answer is that the clothing you bring in your suitcase, that becomes tameh right away, because that enters
only luggage becomes tameh right away.
And not just luggage. If you carry it in your hand, also, if you're if you push it on your shoulder, if you put it on your shoulder, is also the same thing. It doesn't matter if it's in a bag or it's on you're holding it.
If you took your coat off and put on your shoulder, that's not going to get tameh. Okay.
That's going to become tameh right away, because now you're not wearing it. Now you're just
not wearing. Okay.
Yeah, but because you're just you're holding it like a sack or something. But if you're wearing it, that will take time for the clothing to become tameh, and it's based on verses. It's not based on logic here. This is really just simply interpreting the verses, because one verse does not say that the clothing becomes tamei, and the other verse does say that the clothing becomes tamei. So it's based on verses. And let me read it. Susan, do you have a question?
You're not actually talking about the disease. You're talking about if something, that house has something in it, or something has happened in the house that's horrible. Is that actually what?
It's a spiritual sickness that
That's
happens to the house.
That's what I meant. That's what I meant. Okay.
But it's visible physically. It's something that's visible on the physical house. This is called biblical leprosy.
Okay.
Biblical leprosy. This is not medical leprosy.
Right.
This is biblical leprosy. And it's something that's visible sometimes on a person's body. A person's body also sometimes could get biblical leprosy, and that has to do with gossiping.
Now I understand.
Miriam.
You
Now
gossip.
I understand.
It says many sins actually cause it. One of them is gossip.
I didn't.
Everyone
Okay.
knows about that one. There's a number of other sins that could cause biblical leprosy. We don't find biblical leprosy too much nowadays. And the reason, it's interesting, the reason why has to do with the fact that biblical leprosy really affected people who were on a very high spiritual level that were they went a little off, or they missed something. And it's, for us on our level, we're on a much lower level to even be able to,
Especially.
to have biblical leprosy. So that's why you don't find it much. It only affected the righteous, the very close to being fully righteous. That's really the people who it affected. Anyway,
like Miriam.
right, like Miriam. Yes, correct. Miriam got it. Now we go back into the Gemara now. So it says, "Hanichnas lebeis hamenuka," person who enters a house that has leprosy. The Kohen announced that this house is real biblical leprosy. Bekalov al kasefa, and he has his utensils, his clothing hanging on his shoulders, The sandalav b'tabaisav biyadav, and he's holding his sandal and his sandals and his rings in his hand. Hu v'hein tmein miyad, they become tamei immediately. Hayalavash kelav v'sandalav b'raglav, but if he's wearing his clothing, v'tabaisav, that's baisav, and his rings are on his hands, are on his fingers, excuse me. Hu tamei miyad, he is immediately impure. V'hein tahirin, and they are tahor ad sheyisha, until he waits there the amount of time of eating. Eating what? Bichdei achilas pras, the amount of time it takes to eat a half a loaf. Now, half a loaf of what? It takes different time to eat a half a loaf of wheat bread, half a loaf of barley bread, half a loaf of something else, cake. So what does it mean? So it says the land of Israel is blessed with chita, wheat. And it teaches us that wheat, we're talking about the half a loaf of that, the wheat is what we're referring to. It's a half a loaf of wheat bread, paschitim, v'loi pasa'orim. It's wheat bread and not barley bread. I'm just looking on the side. Looks like they add a word here. Achilas prastana paschitin. Okay. Mesa v'oichlan. He leans and he eats it. The lifton with a condiment, because it's easier to eat bread when it has some type of dip on it than to eat plain bread. And so what it's referring to when it says when the law applies of ha'oichel babayis, a person who eats in the house, which means if a person waits the amount of time it would take to eat, it's referring to eating in a pleasant way where a person leans when they eat, so they are relaxed and eat faster, and they also eat with a dip and not just plain bread. And the wheat bread is faster than barley bread. It takes faster to eat wheat bread than barley bread, and that is the amount of time. Now, what is a half a loaf? So a loaf, it's interesting, there is an argument between Rashi and the Rambam, if a loaf is 6 kibetzim, 6 eggs, or a loaf is 8 eggs. So a half a loaf is either 3 eggs or 4 eggs. And what's interesting is you sometimes find in Shulchan Aruch, it says if a person eats like 3 eggs or like 4 eggs, then the law is this. Why does the Shulchan Aruch not tell us clearly, what are you talking about? Is it 3 or is it 4? So the answer is because in Shulchan Aruch, sometimes it's that when it says such a term, it's referring to the 2 different opinions. According to some, it's 3, and according to others, it's 4. But that's what a half a loaf is. It's either 3 eggs or 4 eggs, and that is the difference between Rashi and the Rambam. Yes, Ezra.
I remember when I think we were learning Chulin, there was a discussion and they talked about the fact that there was a change in size during either the Mishnaic period, and the sizes were changed. And so could it be related to that?
No, that's applicable to the size of an olive, and the Rambam and the Rambam and Rashi didn't live that many years apart, so I don't believe that was an issue then. I mean, that's an interesting thought because they do. They didn't live at the same time, but there is a big argument among the rabbis about the sizes, about these measurements, and maybe we'll get into it later. The fact that there seem to be sources that our measurements are much different than the measurements of those days. In other words, our olives are much smaller than the olives of then. In fact, when they came from Israel to bring the fruits to the Jewish people in the desert, they brought the fruits back from Israel. What did it say? It took like 8 people to carry a cluster of grapes, and 1 person to carry a pomegranate. So what do we see from there? That the fruits were huge. So what do you go by? Do you go by the way it was, the way it is, So there's a huge argument, huge debate between the rabbis about these measurements, and that's what Ezra is referring to. An interesting thought that Ezra has, that maybe that's where the argument between the Rambam and Rashi is. But I don't believe that that could be the debate. I did once hear an interesting thing that Rashi is when you abbreviate the name Rashi, Rashi is spelled with 3 letters, and the Rambam is spelled with 4 letters. This is like hinting to their opinion about if it goes by 3 eggs or 4 eggs. But it's interesting when it comes to the laws of Eruv, Rashi holds that you need 4 walls, and the Rambam holds 3 walls. So it's interesting that when it comes to the issues of 4 and 3, the opinions seem to jump to the other. It seems like they're not compatible. Like when it comes to Eruv, they hold one way, and when it comes to the laws of measurements, they seem to. When it comes to the laws of measurement of a pras of food, they switch their opinions. So the Rambam holds by the laws of Eruv. He holds that you need 3 walls, and when it comes to the laws of measurements of food, he goes by 4. So, and the Rashi is also the exact opposite. So Rabbi Weberman, who's a big rabbi here in Florida, I've heard this from him a few times. He always mentions, because food is internal. It's food is something that you eat, and it's the hidden. And therefore Rashi is the acronym of Rashi And the acronym of the Rambam is when it comes to food, you go by the acronym. But when it comes to the measurement of walls, you go by their name. And the name of the Rambam's name was Moshe, and the name of Rashi was Shlomo. So Shlomo is 4 walls. The Rashi holds 4 walls by Eruv, and Moshe would be 3 walls by Eruv. But when it comes to food that are insides, like the acronym, so that Rashi is only 3 letters, and the Rambam is 4 letters. Anyway, it's just a cute little insight that, in any event, going back to what we're talking about. I'm sorry, Simone had a question even before Ezra. I'm sorry, Simone, I forgot to call on you first. Simone?
Yeah. So here's my question. You're saying that the eggs have a liquid inside of them. So the 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 eggs, it's a sort of a liquid measurement, but bread is not a liquid. So one is either bread, you measure it by the weight, it has a certain, it weighs pounds and ounces, or you measure it by its 3 inches, it's 6 inches, it's 8 inches, whatever it is. I don't see how you go from eggs to bread in terms of making a comparison of a measurement.
Right. Well, there are different ways of measuring eggs. What we're talking about here is volume, but you could theoretically go by weight, but we're talking about volume.
Right. So a volume of an egg is the liquid that's in the egg, right?
Not necessarily. It could include the shell as well. I have to be sure. I'm not 100% sure. I have to look it up again, but I believe it might include the shell as well. Let's say. So I mean, I'm not sure what you're getting to. I don't know what it makes a difference, even if it's liquid volume. So
I don't understand.
Compare liquid volume to solid to bread volume. No, can't you compare the two? I mean, if it's 3 centimeters by 3 centimeters, cubic centimeters, this could also be 3 cubic. I'm just saying, I don't know why it makes a difference if it's liquid or not.
Well, are you saying that you line the eggs up side by side and that's how you compare them to a loaf of bread? That's what I don't understand what this relationship is, how you can compare, how you're using 3 or 6 or 8 eggs to say this is a loaf, this is how we determine a loaf of bread.
Right. Well, I mean, if you want to just make it simple, you could think of it in terms of weight and just say, well, an egg weighs this, and so that would be the weight. That would just to be able to relate to this. But if you want to understand it properly, an easy way of figuring it out would be if you dip an egg into water, okay, how much water comes out? And if you take that measurement of water, measure it, it's let's say 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, then you know how many 8 eggs would be. And that amount is the same thing that you would measure for the loaf of bread. That's also centimeters or inches. How many inches is your loaf of bread? And you know, how many inches high? You can easily calculate the volume.
Well, centimeters is not a displacement of water measurement. Centimeters is a physical measurement, not a liquid measurement.
Well, if you would like, then make a little container that's solid of 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, or make whatever measurement you'd like in a solid and fill it with water, the water that the egg displaces, and you will have exactly what we're looking for. So you make whatever measurement you need. I'm just saying that you don't want to use the word centimeter, use boxes, use cubes, I don't know, use whatever you want. Fill them with water, that water. I'm not really sure why you're concerned about liquid measurement. Like, why does liquid have any difference of, you know what I mean? It uses an amount.
Liquid is measured by volume. So you have ounces or quarts or milliliters. Centimeters is direction, a size. So it's just not used so much with liquids. Liquids typically is the volume of liquids.
But can't you use it? I mean, if you have a mold, can't you use it for volume?
You can, but nobody does.
Well, we're doing it. Okay. I don't know. So then I'm not really sure So I would think ounces is weight. It's not volume either. Ounces would be weight.
Yes,
I
ounces
don't
is
think-
weight.
Right. So what would you like to use? What's the term you'd like us to use?
No.
An ounce.
Simone, what
Can
French?
also be for
You don't want me to
volume.
use measurement. What should I use for liquid? What would you rather?
Are
No
you
one
speaking
seems-
to me? Are you speaking to me?
Yeah. What term? What would the measurement? Give me a method of a measurement option, and we'll try
Rabbi,
to.
Well,
there is
yeah,
measurement
That's not,
classes
that's
that are
sort of
That is
not the
involved.
point. That's not the point. The point is, I mean, we can drop it and move on. I just don't understand how it is that you're saying that they're using a comparison of 8 eggs to say this is a whole loaf of bread and therefore, you know what a half of loaf is. It just is not, it's not a apples to
How about this?
oranges comparison.
Okay, how about this? Since you're very nervous about the liquid part, why don't you just think of the shell and just pretend there's no liquid, and we're just doing the shell of the eggs, and then it's a solid. Then we're talking about solids here.
Actual volume.
With eggs, solid eggshells. And the eggshell is a volume of an eggshell. We don't care what's inside, and just use that. Would that make it more understandable?
Well,
Ruben seems to want to answer this
Yeah,
question.
let me-
Ruben, okay.
Okay, you're talking about cubic centimeters. Cubic centimeters is a volume. It's not a length. So I think that's why she's getting confused, because I mean, it doesn't. You can use whatever you want, but I mean, cubic centimeters can be converted to ounces. It doesn't matter whether you use the English system or the metric system. But that's your volume is cubic centimeters, not centimeters.
Right, cubic centimeters. Okay, thank you. Okay, all right.
A measuring cup would give you the volume of the liquid, no matter
Uh-huh. Right.
if it's centimeters or whatever you want to call it. By
Okay,
height.
so in any event, we're going to move forward, and the point is that the verse that says wheat is referring to a measurement, telling us that the law of achilas pras, the law of eating a half a loaf, applies to wheat bread and not to other types of bread and not barley. Okay, and the next thing it says is sa'ira. The next word in the verse is barley. What does that refer to? Ditnan, because we learned also regarding the laws of tumah, impurity, that it says etzem, a bone from a dead body, the size of a sa'ira, of a barley corn. That is what is metame. It will make something else tame if someone touches it. B'maga, with touching, uvemasa, and with carrying. If someone carries it, even if they didn't touch it, if someone carries that, they are going to be tame. And the size is a barley corn. The enai matame ba'oyel, but that measurement is not going to become tame in a oyhel if there is some type of tent that it's in. Normally, very often there are laws of tumah that apply in a tent, that if something is impure in a tent, anything else that's in the tent becomes impure. And the law by a etzem, the law by a bone that's the size of a sa'ira, a barley corn, does not apply to the laws of tent. It only applies to the laws of touching and the laws of carrying. Now, of course, if there was flesh with it, then it would. If there was an olive size of flesh, then it would actually be tameh in a oyhel, in a tent. But the law of sa'ira, etzem sa'ira, the bone that the size of a sa'ira is metame both maga and masa. Maga means touching, masa means carrying. Now, you don't have to touch it when you carry it. You can even carry it on top of something. Now, the next law is geffen. Geffen is used to teach us the law for a nazir. Geffen teaches us Kedei Shiur, Kedei Revius Yayin LaNazir, the amount of a revius of wine for a nazir. In other words, how do you measure? How much is a nazir prohibited with the punishable? How much does he have to eat of a nazir? Is a Nazareth a Nazarite? Nazarite, I think, someone who separates himself from wine and from going to a cemetery and going to separates from wine and from taking haircuts. So a nazir, how much from grapes or grape products does he eat that he is going to be, that's punishable? So the law is that we learn from this. We learn from the word geffen that it applies to a revius of wine. Now, this is an interesting measurement. It's a revius of wine, the measurement of a revius halug, which is a quarter of a lug, which is an egg and a half, because a lug is 6 eggs, and the size of 6 eggs, and the revius, a quarter of that, would be an egg and a half. That is the size that a nazir would be obligated if he ate that measurement, and that measurement applies to even if he eats solids, and even though we're talking about like we're giving the measurement of a revius of wine for eating solids. Now, how do you measure the solids of like, for example, let's say the skins of the grape or the grape itself? How do you measure the amount of a revius, of a quarter of a lug? How do you measure that? So the way it's measured is you would take a cup of wine and you would stick in the cup of wine the amount that it would take to displace the size of an egg and a half. So you need to displace wine. Now, there's a difference between displacing wine and displacing water. If you would put, let's say you have grapes that you're sticking in a cup of water, and you want to displace an egg and a half. So let's say it would be 10 grapes. 10 grapes would displace an egg and a half size when you stick it in water. What about when you stick it in wine? When you stick it in wine, you would actually need 11 grapes because wine is thicker and it stays in the cup. So therefore, what would the measurement based on my calculation here, which is just a rough estimate, it would be 11 grapes, not 10 grapes. And that's the lesson that we learned from the measurement of the geffen, that it's teaching us it's the amount of a revius of wine for a nazir and not the measurement that we normally would use would be water. So for a nazir, we use the measurement in wine, the displacement in wine. Okay, then comes the next case is te'ena. Te'ena means a fig. And that is regarding the laws of Shabbos, carrying on Shabbos. That even though many of us live in cities that have an Eruv, but you always have to remember that there are many cities that don't have Eruvs. They don't have a string around the city, and the law of carrying applies. And the law of carrying is one of the very serious law on Shabbos. The person's not allowed to carry 4 cubits, around 6 feet or 8 feet outside in the street. You're also not allowed to carry from a private domain to a public domain, or from a public domain to a private domain. And the only leniency is if there is an Eruv, and there are many complicated rules that go into, technical rules that go into the creating of an Eruv to make the city considered like a private domain. And there are many cities that cannot be made into a private domain. There are some cities that there's a whole debate if they can be made into private domain. So because of that, it is important to always remember that there are laws. A lot of people get used to carrying in their city. They don't realize that, there is a law in the Torah, that's the law of Shabbos, not carry. So how much does a person have to carry in order to be transgress and be punishable for carrying? So the size is a te'ena is a dried fig, a gregaris. That's regarding the laws of carrying on Shabbos. What about an olive, a pomegranate? Remind the law of a pomegranate. What do we learn from measurement is applicable to be learned from the law of a pomegranate? So the law is regarding a vessel that has a hole in it. Kidetnan, like we learned, kol kli bale batim. Any vessel of a regular household individual, household owner, is, if we now turn the page, Uran kirimoinim, the measurement of a hole that would make the vessel tahar. It would make a impure vessel pure would be if it has a hole the size of a pomegranate. And the reason is because it's not really so usable once you have a hole that size. Now, this law does not apply if it's a store that has a hole in the vessel, because a store, even much smaller than a pomegranate, would make that vessel unusable, and therefore it would be tahor. But for a balabatim, this is only a law regarding the kalim of a balabayas in your house. You would still use a vessel that maybe has some holes, but once it gets the size of a pomegranate, then it's no longer usable for your house. It's basically similar to the fact that you would never buy certain things in the store, but if that's what you have, you'll use it, right? It's and so the thing is, it's still considered usable, and therefore the laws of purity and impurity have a difference if it's a person's own products or something that they're going to sell. Ezra?
Yeah, I think you have to clarify the fact that, you have to have a vessel which is which can be mikabel tuma. It can receive tuma, and if you have a pomegranate size hole, then we say that vessel is, because it's no longer usable, it can't be mikabel. It can't receive or become tameh, and that's the reason why they're saying this. Just to say that if you hold, you have to make that kind of a connection, otherwise it's not understandable.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. I would just add that we're talking not only about becoming tameh, we're talking about it is tameh already, and we're making it tahor. We're actually making it pure from a vessel that was already impure. And the reason why it's pure now is because it is no longer usable as a vessel. It's not really called a vessel anymore. So it becomes impure. It doesn't fulfill the purpose of of what it's meant for, and therefore it no longer is tameh. It loses its tuma because it's not usable anymore. Again, if it has a smaller hole than a pomegranate, you could use it to hold pomegranates. But if it has, or for other things, if it has a hole, smaller than oranges, you could use it to hold oranges. But once it has a hole the size of a pomegranate, it basically is considered, in the eyes of the rabbis, the understanding of the Torah, that would be something that would make it unusable. That would be too big of a hole. And then the verse continues and says, Eretz Zeis Shemen, the land of olive oil, or olives that produce oil. And Amar Rabbi Yosi Reb Chanina says, Eretz Shakol Shiureha Kazisim. What do we learn from the zayas, the size of an olive? That all of the measurements are the size of an olive in the Torah. The Gemara asks, Kol Shiureha Salkadaitoch, do you think all the the measurements of the Torah are all based on the size of an olive. What about all those that we just mentioned? We just mentioned chita, sa'ira, gefen, se'ena, remind. We just mentioned all these. What are you talking about? That everything is the size of an olive? So ella eretz sheroiv shiureha tazisim. This is a item that the majority of all the measurements in the Torah are the size of a olive. And what is that? All the prohibitions, eating blood, fats that are prohibited, leftover meats from the sacrifices, sacrifices that were had the wrong intention in them. So these are all kazayas, the size of the you can't say brachos is the size of a zayas because that's not biblical. That's rabbinic. But we're using the biblical laws of zayas. Again, bench grace after meal is only if you're satisfied. We bench even after eating a kazayas, but that's rabbinic. And even the beginning blessings, you don't need a kazayas either for. So, but I'm giving you other examples of all the prohibitions in the Torah that all are based on a kazayas. And then, of course, the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach night would also be a kazayas. Okay, now dvash, the honey that we're talking about is honey from a date. We're not talking about bee honey, we're talking about date honey. So what is the law of dates? Kikoisebes hagasa biyoim hakipurim. The dates apply to a large date that one would be punishable if they ate that size on Yom Kippur. So interestingly enough, Yom Kippur has a different measurement than normally the size of measurements in the Torah are. It's unique, this law of Kaisebas Hagasa, the large date. That is the measurement of eating on Yom Kippur. Now, V'idach, what does the other opinion who argues on Reb Chanan, how does he know about all these laws of measurements? So it says, Hani Shiurin Behedya Miksivi. Does it say clearly in the Torah these measurements? Does it really say it? You're interpreting, you're really adapting these words to apply to different laws. But does it say it? Is this really a law? I mean, come on, you read that straight. You don't see that in the verse. It's very nice to connect each of these items to a law, but it definitely doesn't say it in the Torah that the law of Tumah applies only to a vessel that's the size of a pomegranate. You don't see that in that verse. You don't see all the other cases because it says Israel is blessed with with dates. That means a big date is the size of eating on Yom Kippur. I mean, you don't see that. Ella midrabanan. Rather, it's midrabanan. Ukra asmachta bialman. The verse is just a asmachta, just a something to lean on. Just in other words, it's a hint. It's not an actual biblical obligation. And interestingly enough, the Gemara in other places brings the same Gemara, but there it uses the term that it's a halacha l'maisha misina. It doesn't say it's midrabanan. It doesn't say rabbinic. It says it's halacha l'maisha misina. It's a teaching that was given to Moses at Sinai. So they're biblical laws, but they're not. You don't see them in this verse. The reason the verse is a nice hint to these laws. Okay, well.